This is Thorium, the rest of the story, part two. This was given at PORCFEST, the Porcupine Freedom Festival, between June 16th and the 22nd, 2025. Now, you see an asterisk next to story because those intrigued with Ayn Rand's thorium involvement can seek out Atlas Shrugged, the rest of the story, and how I contend Atlas Shrugged drew most of its characters and whatnot from the Manhattan Project in the struggles uh, during World War II and after with the what I called the GALT chemical reactor. Anyway, back to this presentation, part two, and the title of this is Thorium Suppression, a 70-year financial damage assessment report card. Now, remember from the introduction, the Chinese were bragging how the turtle beat the rabbit. And recall, too, China entered the race in 2011. That's 55 years after the U.S. began the race. The question is, why? Why were we still at the starting gate essentially 55 years later? Well, it comes down to plans to sabotage. The thorium molten salt reactor race began during World War II and continued even late into the 1960s and even early 70s. There was essentially two teams battling away for 30 or 40 years. To the left here is what I call the 1940 Thorium All-Star Team, and key individuals who knew about thorium and the opportunities with it. Then we have to the right those associated with fossil fuel monopolies and cartels and powers going back centuries, including Churchill, President Nixon, President Truman. All these individuals come into play in all this. And here's how we'll cite examples. For instance, Vice President Henry Wallace was very heavily involved with the Manhattan Project and knew of thorium. He was really the only technical individual on Roosevelt's cabinet, and he had stayed abreast of all this. And many of FDR's policies, if anything happened to him, he would have continued in the fourth term if allowed to be on the ticket. But one of the first things the right did here, Edward Pauley, in the Truman Archives, he confesses all this, is that number one was to get Henry Wallace off the team because he knew Roosevelt. He even says in his article in the Truman Libraries that he knew Truman was going to be Roosevelt was going to be gone quickly into his fourth term. So they knocked Henry Wallace off the ticket. And then, lo and behold, the fortune teller, Edward Pauley, is Roosevelt died early in his fourth term. And at that point, Harry S. Truman took over. And he was really a puppet of Edward Pauley, as Pauley even states in the Truman Library. Once that was taken care of, they had to take care of Jerry Voorhis, also nicknamed by the national media Kid Atlas. He had talked about denatured thorium, and he was earmarked to become the first chairman of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, and they needed to get him out before he could take over the leadership if Jerry won his sixth term. They were so desperate. There's actually a Los Angeles Times advertisement: wanted, desperate politician to do despicable things for cash. Apply in writing to Prescott Bush at Brown Brothers Harriman. And the gentleman who took him up on the offer, and the campaigns were so dirty that he was called Tricky Dick. Yes, we're talking about Richard M. Nixon here. He did beat Jerry Voorhis in the 47 campaign. And so, with that, another Thorium supporter bit the dust. But that wasn't enough. Immediately, under Truman administration, they launched the Atomic Energy Act of 46, which would be implemented in January of 47, which said anything the government does not release in the way of atomic information is considered secret, and if anything is discussed, at that point in time, you're subject to federal prison and bankruptcy, essentially, due to the high fines they would subject you to. And if that wasn't enough, then they went with the National Security Act of 47, which was really to protect the guilty. Now, with this act in place, if the deep state here was found doing illegal activities, they could go to the courtrooms and state national security and not blaming innocence or guilt, but that the topic has to be dropped due to national security. What was included in national security? Anything that the right side here wanted to hide. Well, Eugene Wigner, a close associate and mentor to Alvin Weinberg, started writing on the wall. Things were closing in. He was old and wise enough to say, I'm heading back to Princeton. He left Oak Ridge National Laboratories and washed his hands of all the politics. Well, while Truman was still in office, before he left, he had Congress pass and he signed the Secret Patents Act of 1951. Essentially, what it says is that oil was critical to the United States, a phenomenal resource, and it was going to be protected under national security. And this law stated, it's U.S. Code 35-161, which states the following: no technology can be patented and commercialized that threatens oil. Now, the public wouldn't know about this because it would be held under national security. The only technologies that would be allowed to go forward were those that appeared to compete against oil, but they could only do it due to subsidies by the taxpayer. They could not stand on their own. So it was kind of a false competitor. So anything the government supports through taxes is because the technologies are losers and could not stand up against oil on their own. Then, under the National Security Act and the Secrecy Act, Robert Oppenheimer was a threat. So by 1953, they came up with trumped-up charges to essentially strip him of all security clearances. And after he was forced out of top government, he was watched carefully the rest of his life. If he ever strayed far and tried to expose the truth, bad things could possibly happen to him. And then, as we see, by 1971, Glenn Seaborg, who was the first Atomic Energy Commission chairman, eventually he was eliminated. He was also the gentleman who got the Nobel Prize for first discovering thorium was fissionable. And so there was only one guy left at the fort to battle, and he battled on for another 2 years. And that was the inventor of both the pressurized light water reactor and the geothermal atmospheric liquefied thorium or molten salt reactor, Alvin Weinberg. And they finally caught him trying to get information to the public on the weaknesses of the pressurized light water reactor and how dangerous it was. And because he violated the Secret Patents Act of 1951 and the National Security Act, he was given a choice of federal prison or go make a better life elsewhere, get out of the nuclear industry. And it really wasn't until a year or two before his deathbed that he finally wrote some additional articles about thorium and its importance once he knew he was near the end of his life. And it didn't matter if they came after him or not. And then after getting Alvin Weinberg out, they could finally put the final nails on the coffin under Richard Nixon, who's now president, but it was really Chester Holyfield, Congressman Holyfield, that was number two to Edward Pauley, the puppet master. He pretty much ordered Nixon to begin the EPA. Once they had the EPA established, they could then write up legislation saying that thorium and other rare earth metals, which gives off a little bit of radioactivity, that they should be banned through the EPA and eventually be diverted to China, since they were going to be the next hegemon in the next 50 or 60 years. All this stuff is planned out almost a half century ahead. So, in summary here, the timely deaths of two presidents, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1945, and then later John F. Kennedy, who championed thorium in the 1960s, their deaths helped the powers that be to eventually eliminate GALT by 1969 and substitute the pressurized uranium nuclear reactors with the goal of eventually imploding the industry, which occurred in 1979 with 3 Mile Island. Once that was done, once they got the legislation in place in 1974, now you had to clean up the evidence. And so you'll note that it just so happened in 1974, Richard M. Nixon, President Nixon, was forced to resign, but they also had Chester Holyfield and some other congressmen resign also in 1974, anticipating that when a nuclear accident occurred in the future, there'd be no one left in Congress to tell tales on, in my opinion, the oil industry's complicity in this sabotage and suppression. So, what was the impact of all this? Whereas inexpensive GALT technology would have likely lowered the national cost of energy from 6% to 4% versus the gross national product between 1973 and 2024, Foreign oil dependency with the rise of OPEC also led to an average cost of 8% versus the gross national product. This also contributed to 6 recessions between 1973 and 2006, as you can see here, the recessions. The difference between 4 and 8% of the gross national product amounts to over $40 trillion, which even exceeds America's present national deficit between 74 and 2024. All these funds essentially went to the deep state, the oil industry, the bankers that funded terrorists, and all the chaos going on around the world. How did $100 trillion market, thorium, and rare earth metals end up in China? The EPA was created, as I said earlier, under Nixon in 1970 to eventually outlaw the processing of any material exhibiting radioactivity, no matter how slight. Even though thorium is less radioactive than potassium in the human body, the EPA, they outlawed both thorium and other rare earth metals by 1974. All the leading companies in the United States that was developing this multi-trillion-dollar industry, they had to stave off bankruptcy. They had to sell their patents to China, 10 cents on the dollar, to make any money at all. And there was a lot of screaming and hollering at the time. But this was all swept underneath the rug. Now, in 2000, 54 years after Ayn Rand scribbled, "Who is John Galt?", Ohio NASA physicist Kirk Sorensen discovered a thorium molten salt reactor abandoned behind a vaulted laboratory wall of one of the old Manhattan Project laboratories at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Under the National Security Act of 1947, any knowledge of thorium and the GALT technology could be hidden from the American public. Now, we're going to take a look at what was the impact of the suppression of the thorium technology versus oil prices down below. And this graph's a little hard to read, so we're going to expand it on the next page. So let's explore this graph on the next slide. Here we go. We've blown it up a bit. Now, let's look at some key time periods. It was in 1942 thorium fission for the first time. Then, by 1953, they developed the first 150 kilowatt GALT chemical reactor. In fact, let me back up here a bit. Here was an actual picture from 53 with Alvin Weinberg and others looking at this technology here. And you can see how small it is. Now we'll proceed further. By 1964, they had started construction in 62. By 64, they started operating a 7,500 kilowatt demand molten salt reactor. It was essentially 50 times larger than the first phase one. And as you can see here in 69, here's congratulations going on because they had operated it successfully for 6,000 hours. Everything was looking good on it. Now, there was some metal fatigue. There was some issues with salt corrosion. But the Gray Eagle scientists had indicated, hey, it's just going to be a modification of the metals to handle the corrosion. That was one solution. Another solution was if you took the moisture out of the salt, that's what was accelerating the corrosion of the metal. So you had several different opportunities there and sources of resolving a problem that some people tried to make a big deal out of, but it really wasn't. So here we are. It's running successfully. They're thinking maybe they do a phase 3, just one more test of an even larger one. But because of a phone call made in 1963, the laboratory, Oak Ridge National Laboratories, was wrestled away from civilian scientists, and it ended up in the hands of the military again, who had their own agenda. And one of the things they did is by 1970, they robbed the molten salt reactors of its funding to divert elsewhere, and they shut it down. And then, as Alvin Weinberg predicted and was fired for, a warning that the pressurized light water reactors, there would eventually be an accident and it would implode the system. When in 1979, essentially 6 years after he was fired because he had such major safety concerns that he also tried to get to the public, 3 Mile Island occurred. And when the accident occurred, 50 nuclear reactors were canceled that day. And if you look at the graph here, this is when oil prices started to skyrocket. And you'll see the volatility and the skyrocketing of prices in the future. This is making trillions of dollars for the oil industry, and it's leading to recessions on the part of America and the world at large. So, what did Congressman Voorhees, also known as Kid Atlas, envision for America in '46, and President Kennedy in '62, with the commercialization of GALT chemical reactors by the end of the 20th century? If GALT chemical reactors had been introduced in the early 1970s, this is what we predicted would have happened. The oil monopolies can only control prices if they're over 80% capacity. If they fall under 80% capacity, they collapse. And what would have happened is GALT chemical reactors handling the energy needs of the world. Oil could not sustain an 80% or higher capacity, and the prices would have collapsed, as seen here. As opposed to U.S. experiencing a 50% reduction in energy costs, the oil industry increased revenues $1 trillion a year on average since the 1970s. OPEC would never have it existed. So, how did global elites benefit? By the bait and switch? By sabotaging and eliminating the nuclear energy as a viable competitor to petroleum, the deep state raised the price of oil many times over. In the 1970s, the price of U.S. oil jumped from 6%, as I said, as opposed to, we wanted to go down to 4 when it was at 6 of gross national product, and it jumped to an average of 8% over the ensuing 50 years. Had GALT been chosen, energy costs would have fallen to 4% of the gross national product. Between the early 1970s through 2024, this increased U.S. energy costs more than our entire national debt. Since thorium spent fuel was not a viable material for the nuclear arms race, such a race might never have been launched. The deep state's defense industry achieved almost $9 trillion in nuclear weapons buildup between the 1940s and the 1980s. That's part of our $34 trillion deficit. And that's just on the American side. There's also the USSR buildup. Most of the 129 plus pressurized light water reactor facilities constructed between the mid 1950s through the early 1990s were essentially built by deep state operatives. If the average cost of construction and operation for 60 years of a 1,000 megawatt plant is estimated at $4.9 billion, and that's in 1970 dollars, America spent essentially over $500 billion over a 60-year period. Had GALT been selected for the same physical load, the costs and operating costs of the American economy would have only been 10% or about $55 billion. That's for construction and operation of the molten salt reactors because they operate at atmospheric pressure. You don't need these huge domes to protect against pressurized steam that might explode if there's an accident. So the deep state increased their profits with the pressurized light water reactors from $5.4 billion if they had done GALT at a conservative 10% profit. They essentially made 10 times more profit based on a 10% minimum profit on the construction and operation of these facilities. The profit from the pressurized light water reactor alone would have paid for the entire GALT facilities construction operations. What I'm saying there, take a look at this 54.8 million they made in profit. If those had been molten salt reactors, the entire cost of the molten salt reactors was possibly 54.8. We got screwed. How does global elites benefit by this bait and switch? Well, we've mentioned some stuff already. The deep state companies provided also the rich uranium at prices of around $50,000 per kilogram, and 98% of it is wasted in the facility. And then you have to care for that waste for hundreds of thousands of years, which they also make profit off of. Thorium is around $300 per kilogram. By selling, there was also a case by selling 20% of the uranium to Russia, that was uranium run under Hillary Clinton, would they be able to significantly increase U-235 enrichment costs in the future? The deep state likely will capture decommissioning costs of the pressurized light water reactors also at many billions of dollars per plant location. The cost of decommissioning may be more than the cost of building the facilities in the first place. There's also a sword of Damocles. If the deep state really wishes to destroy the United States, just take down the electric grid for more than 3 months. When backup generators run out of fuel, hundreds of Fukushima events could occur all over the U.S. from lack of cooling. And that's something we don't want here with the hydrogen explosions. Let's take a 5-minute break.